And as you said, I'm going to be talking about some of the top trends in networking, looking from the 2023 kind of forward, from here going forward. Before I start, I did want to answer the question that some people may be asking, who let this guy in? Why am I here? As Kenny mentioned, I am a practice lead both for the network and edge practice and the security and risk practice. So all the research analysis that goes on at GigaOM in both networking and security comes across my desk, which gives me a really good view of the industry that I appreciate. How I got here, about 20 years as a network engineer. I've worked on internet service providers, network service providers, managed service providers. I've worked for value-added resellers across both data center and cloud estates, as well as many enterprises. Along the way, I've been lucky enough to have written a couple books and several patents, and I've given talks in 35 countries across 5 continents. So whether or not that makes me an expert, I'm not sure. I think experts are a lot like hipsters. If someone tells you they are one, they probably aren't. But those are the credentials there. And without further ado, I'll just lay this out here up front. I think the 5 trends that all of us need to be aware of right now in 2023 and then looking forward for the next few years are here on this slide. So deparameterization, network as a service, net DevOps, observability, and Netsecops. So I'm going to go through each one of these a little bit more detail. Hopefully you're somewhat familiar with at least some of these. And if not, here's the chance. So first, deparameterization. It's always fun to have giant multisyllabic words in your slides. Deparameterization is really just the idea that, 20, 30 years ago, maybe even a lot less for some of us, we used to, maybe work inside of one office. The people were at desks inside of that office. The servers were in a closet inside of that office. At the end of the day, we could lock the door and maybe even unplug the internet from the firewall if we wanted to, and everything was nice and secure. Obviously, that's not the world we live in today. That perimeter, that castle wall that used to be around both our physical location of an office as well as the logical operations of our IT networks and systems have gone away largely. We first moved out into data centers and then moved into colo facilities and have now moved largely into the cloud in a lot of ways, whether it's just software as a service for your CRM or email or chat servers, or full-on infrastructure as a service for your application base. Much of what we're doing is now outside of our control, or at least on infrastructure outside of our control. So we're using networks that we don't own and operate ourselves, but they have to be part of our infrastructure. And this deparameterization initially came across as a security issue because, again, you had that firewall at the edge of your network before that connected you to the internet and protected you from the internet. And that went away as folks moved outside of the office, both in the migration of applications, as I talked about, moving those from on-premises servers out into the cloud, but also as folks have gone more remote and more distributed. We've got employees and partners and customers all over the world now in a lot of cases that need to access those applications. And so again, the ownership of one LAN that connected everything has largely gone away, and we've moved to access over ownership in a lot of ways. And I look at this a little bit like when just kind of the transition of automobiles over the last 100 years since they were first invented. In the very early days, if you bought a car, you had to either be a mechanic or hire a mechanic because it was always breaking down. There was a lot of mechanical difficulties. Even getting it started was a problem. And so you really had to, both own the car, but also be really involved in the maintenance and upkeep of the car and probably work on it on the way to your destination. Over time, cars have gotten more reliable, and then we started outsourcing mechanics, and all the way up to today where you may even outsource your transportation completely, meaning you may call a taxi or an Uber or a Lyft to ride around in. And so you've kind of traded the ownership of the car where you had to do everything for it to access to transportation, which is what you really wanted. And that's happening with our networks as well and our server infrastructure and everything else as we move to the cloud and other paradigms like that. But obviously there's security implications in that. And a big part of that has been the move towards zero trust and some other things like that. But on the networking side, it's just as big of an issue. And the reason is that instead of managing a single LAN and maybe even a single WAN, now we're stitching together multiple networks, right? Maybe you need to connect to Azure or GCP or Oracle's cloud. And you also need to connect to Microsoft 365 or to the Google Suite, to Slack, to Zoom, or today to Live Studio and Global Meet. And connecting all that stuff together, again, is over access to networks that you don't necessarily own. A lot of it goes over the internet, and you're connecting to other networks where your resources may live. And so really the bottom line here is that interconnection has become something that we all need to pay attention to. It used to be something that only internet service providers really worried about. But now interconnecting networks together and making sure that we can operate our infrastructure over multiple networks is part of the game. And so I think that's kind of the first one here, is that interconnection really is king going forward as that access takes over ownership. And so as we're working with multiple networks and stitching them together, we really need to pay attention to how that works. The next trend is somewhat related. Network as a service is kind of rising. And this is tied obviously to some of the same trends I was just talking about, which is this kind of everything as a service model, and kind of moving a lot of our services and stuff out onto the internet, onto other networks. And so there are some service providers out there that will provide network as a service. But I think it's more than just that, right? It's not just the idea of potentially hiring someone to run a network for you as a service, but also being able to do that internally on the networks that you do own and providing network as a service to the rest of your organization, to your internal customers, as well as potentially external customers, right? In this, I think there's an important distinction here between a managed service and as a service. And to me, the managed service is all about calling someone on the phone to do provisioning, to do troubleshooting, where you've got to reach out and talk to a person, maybe open a ticket, and then work through that process. Whereas as a service should be machine-based, right? It trades the phone for an API, and you can use applications to interact with your service provider in a more mechanistic fashion, right? More automated fashion in a lot of ways. One thing that's really important about the idea of network as a service, in my opinion, is this idea of business agility. And I think that one of the reasons we have largely moved into the cloud and done a lot of the things we have over the last 20 years in IT is for additional agility, right? The ability to spin things up, spin things down, change things on the fly. All of that flexibility is kind of built into a lot of these as a service models. And for a long time, the network has been, in some ways, the weakest link, at least when it comes to agility. And that's largely because the network has to be bomb-proof, right? It's the foundation of your entire IT estate. It has to work. If it goes down, a lot of other things break. And so you really want to keep that controlled and reliable and resilient. But it's no longer an either-or proposition between reliable and agile. And so this network as a service modality is really important to kind of ensuring that the network is no longer that weakest link in agility, and that the network can support the business's pace of innovation going forward. And so I think all of us must move towards an as-a-service delivery model for our customers, whether those are, again, internal customers or external customers. Of course, how we're going to do that is complicated. But it does rely on automation, but not just automation. I think the next big trend here is in net DevOps. And this is, beyond automation, it also includes orchestration and really some other key concepts here, because automation obviously is a way to, make tasks repeatable by a machine. It's a little bit of outsourcing to a robot in that way. Orchestration is kind of the automation of automation, where you can take these strings of automation and put them together into bigger, more complex tasks. But beyond that, I think this idea of, net DevOps, of really integrating the network into the software development lifecycle and the application kind of continuous delivery, continuous improvement ideas, a lot of that starts with this idea of infrastructure as code, and specifically a source of truth. And so in order to build a great source of truth, we need to move from having the configurations on devices on the network be the ultimate arbiter of how the network works, and pull that off to some other source of truth, maybe a database or maybe some other application or a program that can hold the policy and the policies, the templates, and all of those things that we need to operate the network. So you're making changes offline in a way, right? In this kind of central repository that is the source of truth for everything that's then going to be pushed into the network with automation. And in that way, you can actually move to a model where people don't log into devices or functions and can instead be working kind of more in this, again, kind of software development lifecycle modality, which becomes much more reliable, much more agile. It's kind of, this is kind of the foundation for network as a service offerings. And really looking at this kind of whole life cycle of the network and looking at the entire network as a system rather than as a collection of devices. So I think, this idea of embracing source of truth and embracing the idea of infrastructure as code and embracing the software development lifecycle and looking at the network the same way that we look at other parts of our IT infrastructure is really important. The next one is observability. And I think observability is interesting mostly in kind of contrast to monitoring, right? And monitoring is a lot about alerting, red, green, up, down, is the interface working? Is the CPU overloaded? Is the memory full? And we need to move beyond that to, more true observability. And observability, I think, is really about the ability to ask questions of the network and have them answered in real time. There's a couple of ways to do this. I think one is to focus on looking at all of the traffic on the network, as in almost like a packet capture type methodology, and analyzing the traffic as it crosses the network so you know exactly what's going on all the time. Another way is to look at the state of the network devices and understand what's going on in the network through interface states, protocol states, all of that stuff. And then also being able to roll that back and look back in time, I think is really important so that you can answer questions in the past and understand, okay, when this problem was happening at 3:45 on Wednesday, what was the state of the network then? Or what did the traffic look like on the network then? And that's what observability is really all about, is being able to ask those questions and have them answered in real time, but also being able to query back in time and look at state in different areas, because that's really super, super helpful for troubleshooting and for root cause analysis. All of that is really in service to ensuring a great quality of experience for your network. So what I mean by quality of experience is not just like, is the network up or is it down? I think at this point, we've moved beyond that a little bit. I mean, the fact that we have Wi-Fi on airplanes traveling 600 miles an hour at 30,000 feet, we know the network is going to work. It should be working most of the time, but how well is it working, I think, is the new really important metric, right? Are your applications able to communicate with each other at the latency and bandwidth that they need? Is there packet loss that's causing problems with audio or video on calls such as this one, and things like that, right? So moving beyond just the simple monitoring to true observability to understand what the quality of experience is for folks that are using your network is super important. And then the final trend I want to talk about today is what I call Netsecops, or really the convergence of networking and security. And this, we've seen this kind of play out in some commercial applications such as SASE. At GigaOM, we talk about a secure service access, which is a little bit more advanced, I think, than SASE. But again, it's, these things are all looking at this convergence of networking and security, which again goes back to some of the things I talked about earlier in this idea that we have access to networks rather than ownership. We're stitching things together. We're doing this automation. And as we kind of move towards more of a zero trust model, the network becomes a foundational layer for security to happen at. And so it's very natural that networking and security would come together in this way. What's interesting there, though, is that raises a lot of questions at the organizational level often, right? So if you're buying a service that is both networking and security focused, or a tool or a device or whatever it might be, whose budget does that come out of, right? Is this a networking budget? Is this a security budget? How do we justify that purchase and who pays for it? And then also the operations of it, right? So again, if you've got this combined tool, product, service, whatever it is that's doing both networking and security, who's the admin on that, right? Who's the engineer who needs to work on that? Is it the networking team? Is it the security team? Do we need to combine those teams? Do they need to cross-functional? How does that all work? And those are some really interesting questions, I think, as we move into the future here of Netsecops and the convergence of networking and security.